profiles, a chance to meet some of the people who make Capilano College such an interesting place. My name's Crawford Killian. It's been said in the universities that the slogan is publish or perish. Well, at Capilano College, the slogan seems to be publish and flourish. We have a great many writers on the faculty, and one of them has joined me today. He's Bill Schermbrucker from our English department. Hi, Bill.
Hello, Crawford.
You've just recently published a book called Chameleon, which came out in 1983, I believe.
In December of '83,
December
yes.
of '83. How's it doing?
It's getting quite nice reviews, and I get invitations to go to different places and read and talk about it. Sales-wise, I don't know yet.
Yeah.
We believe there are about 4,000 serious readers in Canada of this kind of stuff, so I don't know if we're hit the 2,000 yet.
Now, what exactly do you mean by this kind of stuff?
Well, I suppose this is serious literature. It's not entertainment or escape or any of the Harlequin brand of writing. Nor is it detective fiction, which I also am quite interested in. This is serious autobiographical fiction, in fact. Autobiographical,
meaning it's dealing with your own life, which started in Africa, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. It's an attempt to shape my own memory and selective record of my growing up in Africa through the period of the Mau Mau and the change from colonial status to independence. 8 stories more or less following in sequence and more or less interconnected, and more or less based on my life, but with certain changes and liberties that the fiction writer takes.
What kind of society was that you were growing up in the 1950s in Kenya?
Above all, it was a society that did not have open discussion. In the post-war years, there was a certain amount of boom happening for the farmers, but there was also a growing underground political movement, and the more it grew, the more the British repressed it and the more it went underground. And I grew up as a kid not really understanding what was happening around me. I mean, there was a massive social change, political change happening, but we couldn't discuss those things. We could only discuss sports or trips to the game park and things of that sort that were not of a political nature.
And this was the sort of thing, the sort of tension that you were trying to bring out in the stories in Chameleon then?
Yes, I found myself, when I first came to Canada in '64, and then when I became an immigrant some years later, I found myself turning my back on Africa. I don't really like immigrants who are always talking about the old country, you know. It really irritates me. In fact, I mentioned in the preface a woman that I've known that I know on the North Shore who's lived here for 14 years, and she still refers to Canada as over here, as though she really lives somewhere else, and this is just a camping trip. However, I found that after about 15 years in this country, I began to be interested in reinterpreting my own past. So, and people seemed to like the stories, magazine editors published them, and so I thought, well, I'll work that vein out and be done with it.
And then go on to whatever other subject. Well, there's no reason, of course, why a Canadian writer can't choose to write about Africa or Australia or any other place.
Yeah.
I have a sense that you grew up in Nairobi.
Yes.
Which was then, I guess, the biggest city in Kenya, as it must be now.
Yes.
What was that life like for a kid?
Well, we went to boarding school. Most people did. Schools were segregated. When I say most people, I mean then most whites. You didn't see your parents much during the term time. You came home for the occasional Sunday out. In the holidays, we either stayed at home in the city, and then later on, when I was about 12 or so, we moved out to, or no, about 10, we moved out to a coffee estate. My father had, this big estate had been divided up, and my father had bought a plot. So I had a kind of lonely life in the country, or we went and stayed on the farm, and that was wonderful, my godparents' farm. That was an extraordinarily rich environment. We could go and help with any aspect of the farming, or fool around in the dairy, or build forts in the big storage sheds where the sacks of cattle feed were kept, make knives down at the blacksmith's shop, make bricks at the brick factory, pressing out the mud and the straw in the hand press, and go riding on horses, go fishing in the dams. The farm was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. How did this experience translate itself into your stories? What sort of use did you find yourself making of it?
I found myself writing about the farms, more than one farm. There was the normal farm that we went to, which was close by, but there was an extraordinary year when my father sent us to a very distant farm, to people that we hardly knew. And that was interesting for me as a fiction writer, because that happened in 1948. And it was in 1974 that I began writing that story, which is how many years later? 26 years later. And it was only in writing the story that I realized what my father had done, why he had sent us to the remote farm, which was basically that my mother was dying.
Mm-hmm.
And they had decided to take a life or death risk operation in England on her cancer in the neck. And he decided to send us as far away from all this as possible, to people who wouldn't really be clued into what was going on, and hoping, I suppose, that she would just be fixed and he'd bring her back and life would continue. And so I fictionalized that story, and in writing it I found out what had happened, because of course in those days you never said a word like cancer.
Mm-hmm.
That would be an obscene term. And my father didn't explain to us that my mother was ill. Even when she died, he refused to let us go to the funeral. I don't know if that's some quirk of the culture or some quirk of the man, but anyway, you asked how did it all translate into fiction. That's one thing. I also, in this book, set out to deliberately create some of my generation, who are now mostly scattered all over the world. Some of them are famous, like Roger Whittaker, but most of us are living in isolation from one another in places like Calgary or Perth, Australia, or Vancouver, or in England, and so on. And I wanted in 3 of the stories to tell how it was for young men being drafted into the army to fight against the uprising against the Mau Mau, and the extraordinary violence that they were thrust into. See, they were the most useful soldiers to the British forces because they spoke the native languages and they knew the country. And so the British might bring in their crack teams from Malaya or the Inniskilling Fusiliers or somebody, but without some local intelligence, those people were floundering around a little bit. And so these 17, 18-year-old boys were key people in the war.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them died very violent deaths, and the others who didn't came out of the experience, I think, somewhat shocked.
Mm-hmm. We've brought in some slides to show us something about what this environment was that you grew up in. Perhaps this would be a good time to take a look at them.
Yes, Crawford. I'll start with some pictures from an old snapshot album that I found on my return to Africa for the first time in 20 years. I went back this past summer, and I don't know if the camera can get in on this here. We'll just see if I can show you. This is the building of our house, which my father saw as I think a very permanent Rock of Gibraltar kind of place. And there you see my mother and my brother and myself standing in the coffee, and there's the house being built, the garage, and then the garage extends to the kitchen. Notice all these gum trees behind. The whole kitchen wing is finished. Then we start on the main wing of the house, and it extends. The stone all cut on the property, local masons hired, and the windows going in, and nearing completion, and finally the finishing off in the fireplace. And then this picture here, which shows me as a little boy standing in the backyard where my mother's insisted the place be walled off so that washing can hang there, and the tank of water on the top. And then if we look at the slides, slides are made from snapshots that I took on my trip back this summer, and this shows the condition of the house now. We see it's somewhat dilapidated, although the trees that we planted are still there. I don't know who's living in it now. We can go to the next one. There you see what was once a quite lush and lovely garden, somewhat run down. It was a terrible shock to me, a great lesson in mutability.
Mm-hmm.
There's that same wall at the back that you saw me standing in with the washing. And this old hanger-on, a friend of my parents who never left, who drove me out there. We wander around curiously. I don't know if you can see the heavy burglar bars set into the window there. We see them again, the front porch.
Am I right in assuming that there was not just a family who lived in the house, but your servants and so forth as well?
The servants lived in their own quarters just a little bit removed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we've moved on. From the house, we've moved to the other place that was important. This is the farm. We see the milking operation going on in the morning. There's my godparents' house still there. And there they are, the old folks, and their son, the old folks, 86 and 85. And their daughter-in-law in the background. And there's the young couple standing in front of the Norfolk Hotel, the famous Norfolk Hotel in Nairobi, on the morning that they picked me up. And here we see the dryness of that country. It's not just Ethiopia that's experiencing the drought. That's the back of the young folks' house, and you can see just absolutely sere drought. And this was the morning I left, and Jane was playing Silver Threads Among the Gold. And the old lady was singing her lungs out at the age of 86. It was quite touching. This shows the dryness of the farm. An astute viewer at home with sharp eyes can pick out Mount Kilimanjaro on the left, just above the horizon. And these are the 3 drinking cups that we used to, as kids, drink our milk out of in the farm. And here you see the life of dogs and aloes and just a very rich environment. And the creamery, employing people to do things that are done by machines here. Loading up the cream. And inoculating for hoof and mouth disease. And twisting a rawhide employs a man for 2 days rather than just going down to the hardware store and buying nylon rope. But security is a problem, and so there's the big steel gate. And then after I'd been on the farm, I took a trip out into town, and there I met one of my former students, who's now the managing editor of one of the newspapers, and he's signing his novel for me as I've put mine on his desk.
Mm-hmm.
And there's my mother's grave, which was quite a touching thing for me. My mother was quite important to me. Let me just show you something else that I found, if we can get the camera on this. This is a very early picture of my mother and her siblings. My mother is this one here, and I knew very, very little about her life. And this picture is taken in about 1923 or something like that. And she died in 1950, and quite a remarkably good-looking woman. Here's another shot, studio portrait of her later. And in the course of my trip back, I found that I began to redefine myself as a person, not so much in terms of my father, but in terms of my mother. And I think a whole other book is coming out of that.
Mm-hmm. I get the sense of a society with a very short history, but a very intense one. That is that from the beginnings of white settlement in Kenya to the end of the colonial era was really only a generation and a bit. And
That's
yet
absolutely right.
the settlers seem to have managed to pack an awful lot of important experience for them into that period, which may help to explain why some white writers out of Africa seem to have this intense longing and nostalgia for that time and place. Is that something that you think you share, or?
I'm afraid so. One of the reasons I think why I was afraid to go back to Africa was that it might exert too much of a pull on me. You know, when you've decided to make your life in another country, then you do that. I think life for us growing up as privileged white kids in Africa was extraordinarily rich, you know. Sure, we caught a few tropical diseases and that kind of thing, but we had freedom to go everywhere, to meet so many people. We didn't have the luxury mansions of the, you know, the wealthy southern United States or something of that sort, but we did have the farms that we could wander on, and really a very peaceful country. Although there was later the turbulence of Mau Mau, I was never afraid as a kid to get on my bike and just ride off into the native villages and spend the whole day talking with illiterate people who are awfully friendly, and going into their huts and sharing their food with them and playing with the kids and so on. It was a very rich, textured life, I think.
Mm-hmm. So here at Capilano, you've been teaching since 1968.
That's right, same as you.
Indeed, we are getting long in the tooth. You have been the coordinator of the English department at various times. You've been, I think you must have taught every course there is in the English department at one time or another.
Never taught Canadian Lit. I don't feel confident to teach that.
What are you working on now? What are you teaching now?
At the moment, I'm teaching several literature courses and just one composition course. I like teaching composition courses, so I do that a lot. I'm hoping next fall that we'll be able to offer once again my advanced composition course, the English 102. It attracts very interesting students, people who have it in them to write articles or books or something of that kind. It's unfortunately been a victim of the cuts, but I hope we'll be able to get it back again next fall.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that your own writing influences the way you teach writing?
Gee, that's hard. There are certain skills that I've learned as a writer that I can impart to students, yes. But mostly in teaching composition, I'm teaching people how to write essays that are useful in college, and that's a little different than writing a work of fiction that's going to sell, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, what is your next project then? You talked about perhaps working on something to do with your mother, but what else are you planning to do?
I've got about 3 manuscripts on the go at the moment. One of them is very much focusing on cars. I think it was McLuhan who said that the automobile is the extension of personality. I have been accumulating a book in which the unifying thread between all the pieces is that cars appear in it. It's a book of stories linked together through cars. It's called Written in Cars. I'm also working on another book which is called Letters to My Father, which is in a sense the conversations that I would like to have had with my father and never did. Mm-hmm. Those 2 are on the go. I'm also beginning to put together a book of the travels that I recently took, and I've applied for a Canada Council grant to write a novel based on my mother's life. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of projects in the go, and one or other of them has to hit the finish line pretty soon.
Well, I wish you luck with them.
Thank you very much, Crawford.
Well, we've been talking today with Bill Schermbrucker of the English Department at Capilano College, one of the many writers on the faculty, and as you can see, a man of remarkable background and many talents. My name's Crawford Killian. The show has been Profiles. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
For a long time. We've had the justifications of the 50s for this, and we could go back Cold War, and I don't blame them on the West's fall. The Cold War started in 46, 47, and 48 under Stalin. The United States and the rest of the world responded to that. But I think that we have gotten stuck in our thinking of what happened at that time and not taken into account the world since then. I think we've opened up a number of areas, all of them. Pointed out many things that are true. But by golly, most Frenchmen take a din fewer than Englishmen, and most Englishmen take a din fewer. Now, in the case of Russia and the United States, you come from the Ukraine, and you've had a long history of having the wars and things like that over the last 300 or 400 years. I can see why you have a great resentment against the Russians. I have friends who come out of Russia, ones who wanted to get out of Russia. Since they've gotten out of Russia, I have a feeling that they wipe Russia off the face of the earth. They have a deep feeling that they do the right thing. People and their families are still there, still like that. But I don't understand today why children growing up in the United States or children growing up in Canada, unless they've been taught so well by their parents, would have any reason to hate the Russians, to hate the commies, to spend their lives being anti-communist and going off to fight battles and soldiers of fortune and that sort of thing. And there's no reason for it. I think that time will solve these problems. I don't think you can sustain this sort of thing that grew up out of the 50s for a great length of time. Where it came from. I watched it happen. In 1949, China became communistic. There was Russia, there was China, then Russia had its satellite countries all around it. And then came all of Southeast Asia would fall, and we had the idea of the domino theory. And we got to the point where we saw the communism take down through Vietnam, get Indonesia, get Australia, New Zealand, then start up the west coast of South America, and eventually chopping up the goodies in North America. That's where things were there. And it was one of those images that helped the Vietnam War. But I think we've learned an awful lot in the 50 years since that. There is no such thing now as monolithic communism. There are the Russian communists. There is Yugoslavian communism. In fact, when you start looking, counting the people who are on our side versus their side, I think there are more communists on our side now than there are on their side. Someone once pointed out that there's one nation in the world which is completely